very bright and clear.
Okay, that's great.
All right.
All right. Hi.
I think they definitely clapped louder for you than for me.
I don't know how loud they clap for you, and I can't see them either. So.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think the best format for this would be if one of you got any questions. We have a mic. You can just ask. I have actually a couple of questions on my own. I can ask in the meantime before people here get. So I'll start right away. So one of my questions is, you guys, when you started out with Apollo, I think pretty much about a year ago, I think one of the big premises of Apollo was to make Apollo the easiest GraphQL client. So how far did you already get on this, and what are the big steps you still want to take to make it even easier?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. When we started out a year ago, we actually considered using Relay, and we looked into it and we realized that it wasn't actually that easy to use for us because it only worked with React and it required all these build steps. And so we set out to build an easier client. Another reason for that was that we recognized that actually the difficulty of adopting Relay was a pretty big hurdle in adopting GraphQL. And we thought GraphQL is really amazing and everyone should be able to use it. So that's how we started with Apollo Client. And initially we thought, oh yeah, we can write a GraphQL client in a couple of weeks. It shouldn't be too hard. You just,
well, you kind of did.
Yeah, you stuff everything in a normalized cache, and then you send queries to the server, and you're done. But it actually didn't turn out to be that easy. I do, however, think that we got a pretty long way, and Apollo Client is definitely a lot easier to use than Relay, and it's super simple to get started. The one thing that, however, is not super easy right now, we think, is if you want to update your cache after mutations and things like that, because that turns out to be a really hard problem in GraphQL. But maybe we shouldn't get into this super small detail there.
Yeah, but I totally agree.
Yeah, so in terms of how far along we are actually getting ready to publish a release candidate for Apollo Client 1.0 because we think it's pretty much ready, that we have a pretty stable API that we are happy with supporting for at least a couple of months without changing too much. And that doesn't mean we'll stop developing, but it means we'll take a short break and really focus on documentation, focus on improving tutorials, because that's part of the feedback that we got from the community, that even though it's easy to use, if there's not enough examples out there or not enough documentation, it's not that simple to figure out how to make the first step. And we really want to make that first step very simple.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the point you touched on previously about cache invalidation, that's a super hard problem. And I think Relay solves it in a particular way, which just imposes a bunch of constraints on you, and either you go for it or not. And you get a bunch of benefits by doing so, but it just works in a very limited set of examples. So I think Apollo is a way more flexible client on that regard.
Yeah, so that's really something that we focus on. We actually tried out a bunch of different methods for mutating the cache. So first we had sort of this declarative update queries thing that we still have. Then we tried something more like a type of reducer. And actually very, very early, we tried something similar to the mutation configs that Relay has, but we realized that those were actually pretty cumbersome to use. And what we're going for now is making Apollo Client as flexible and sort of as unconstraining as possible so that people can build whatever they need on top of primitives. So what we're working on right now is a set of imperative cache updates that you can write to the cache, you can read from the cache at any node in the graph on your client. And on top of that, it's actually possible to build everything, including stuff like relay mutation configs. So we're kind of pivoting a little bit from making it as simple as possible to making it as sort of flexible and as powerful as possible. Because we realize that if you choose the right primitives that are very unconstraining, that give you a lot of freedom, then people have they have the power to experiment with that and to build the sort of right constraints on top of it that make things easier to use. And that's really what we want to do with Apollo Client, to kind of empower the community and let them figure out, what the best GraphQL client is for them.
Right, that makes a bunch of sense. So another question I had in mind, but maybe the community here is already ramping up for some questions. So one in the meantime from my side is GraphQL subscriptions. There's like a huge momentum currently around GraphQL subscriptions, and well, luckily there's now our RFC process going about them. But I think you guys very much pioneered around GraphQL subscriptions and really wanted to make it available to the broad public. We also try to contribute as much as possible there. So what do you think? How far are subscriptions? What do you think? How they relate to live queries, for example? And what can we kind of expect on that end?
Yeah, so we are like super thrilled to see the pull request to the spec with the RFC for subscriptions, because we've been working on that for a pretty long time. I would say we started in August or even in July, like 7 or 8 months. And we actually went to the Facebook team and we said multiple times, like, look, people want subscriptions. Like, we've built some experimental thing into Apollo. We think these are the right sort of trade-offs, like how specific the spec should be, what things it should specify and what things it should leave open. And we actually had to do quite a bit of work to convince the Facebook team, like Lee Byron and Rob Zhu, to start working on subscriptions. And I think part of the reason they started doing it is because you guys also built in support for the subscriptions the way Apollo did it. So we kind of forced their hand to actually publish an RFC. But yeah, so I'm really excited about that, and I think this is just the first step, and it's a great moment for people to provide feedback, for them to say, like, well, shouldn't this be in the spec, for example, or why is that other thing in the spec? I think you could make different choices here. For example, it would be way too specific if it said you need to use some event queue or something like MQTT or something like Redis, to get events, because that really isn't something that the subscription spec should specify, because it has nothing to do with GraphQL. But maybe there are other things that should be in there. What I'm really pleased about,
I think it's all about this balance, right?
Yeah, it's very much
all about the balance of what and whatnot. Sorry about the delay. All right.
Yeah.
Other more questions from the community.
Yeah. Who has a question?
So I can try to change the monitor, but you have to trust me that there is a person asking a question.
Okay, I'll believe you.
Hi guys. Well, I'm hoping you hear me. So thank you very much for the talks and everything. My question is a bit more generic. I've got an app that's got a REST API or maybe something else, WebSockets. If I want to use Apollo or Relay, do I migrate or do I rewrite everything from scratch?
So
I think, yeah, sorry, Jonas, take this one. Yeah.
No, go ahead. I think you were probably trying to ask or get more specifics on the questions.
Exactly. So are you talking about the front-end side or the back-end side?
Both. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't think you have to rewrite your entire app, but in general, you probably, when let's say you have a front end and you have a back end, you'll have to rewrite at least some part of it. And I think the greatest benefit that you get from GraphQL is at the moment in the front end, where you can make things really simple and you can have clean higher order components when you're using React, for example, or Angular 2. And so I think it makes sense to do some rewriting there. But if you had like really clean abstractions for data loading, then it's actually pretty simple to rewrite that into GraphQL. And in terms of rewriting your server, the great thing about GraphQL is that it's an abstraction layer between the front end and your back end. So it abstracts away the specifics of the databases. So the front end doesn't need to know if this is a SQL database or whatever, right? And so you can actually move that layer of abstraction around. So if let's say you don't have control over the back end and it's run by someone else, then you can first introduce GraphQL in your front end, and you can put the thing that's usually considered the GraphQL server actually in your front end. And all it does is make requests to your REST API, which means you can change out your front end and leave your back end completely the same, right? But you cannot do the other way around, right? You cannot change your back end to use GraphQL completely and not change your front end, because really GraphQL is sort of a front end driven thing. So you have to make some modifications to your data fetching. But if you don't want to change your back end initially, you actually don't have to at all. So you can sort of adopt these changes incrementally. And you can also do it component by component if you want in your app. So I think that's really the great thing about GraphQL and Apollo. I'll say this though, if you want to use Relay, it's a little bit more complicated, because with Relay you do pretty much have to rewrite everything, at least that's in the tree underneath the component that you're rendering, because Relay actually has its own router, and it has a lot more constraints than Apollo. And you might also have to rewrite your backend, because Relay requires something like requires connections to do pagination, which means you have to return a cursor for everything. It also requires unique IDs for all your objects. So if you don't have that in your backend already, it might be a little bit complicated, or a little bit more complicated to adopt Relay than Apollo.
All right. So he nodded. So that's a good sign.
Okay.
Do we have other questions? So yeah, actually there are a bunch of people and a lot of hands now raising. That's amazing.
So I don't know exactly who to address my question, but I will try to address to you. You said that it's not necessary to use a client, that you could implement your own. Mm-hmm. Does this mean that you don't need to follow, you don't need to use TypeScript or ECMA 6 or any kind of technology? It's
the way how you communicate with GraphQL is entirely up to you, really. So you can do it using curl from your command line. You can. It's also completely independent from any kind of language. So if you want to use JavaScript, do that. If you want to use some kind of server-side language, you can do that. All what GraphQL clients do for you is that they make it a lot easier and lot more GraphQL-like to work with it. And I think one of the taglines of Apollo client is that it has a lot of caching logic baked into it. I think this was also one of the premises you set out to, and something like this is obviously not baked into curl or fetch. So by using a GraphQL client, they do a lot of work for you, and it turns out building a GraphQL client is not an easy job.
And just thinking the modern web development, if I wanted to use Apollo in my normal web app, like developing JavaScript in the front end, is there like a plugin you can use or a library?
So that depends on which view layer you're using, but if you're using Angular or React or Vue or Ember, there's libraries for Apollo with all of these. So the main one that we have, and also the one that's most used, is React Apollo, and that makes it super easy to kind of keep your components pure and then attach a React Apollo higher order component to it, which when rendered will send a query to Apollo client, we'll fetch it from the server, put it in the cache, and then render the component with the data. So it makes it really easy to keep track of loading state and keep your components data updated.
Right. Yeah. And I would just encourage you to just try out Apollo, and it's probably the easiest way for you to get started. Right. The next question.
So we have the last question.
The last question.
But
I'm sorry,
for
Jonas.
more questions, we have the workshop for tomorrow. So it's a good opportunity as well, to join us.
Exactly.
I think so.
All right. Our time is about to end, Jonas.
Sorry. Bringing back the discussion on the subscription and real-time queries, but this made me think about Meteor, data layer, so these kind of real-time things. But what is the difference between what the Meteor, for instance, already have and what's GraphQL real-time queries can do?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. When we started out, diving into GraphQL and implementing Apollo, the intention that we had was to replace or provide a new data layer for Meteor, because Meteor's data layer is really amazing if you want all reactive data all the time, and if you're using MongoDB. But if you're not using MongoDB on the back end, it's more difficult to use Meteor. And if you don't want your data on the clients to be reactive all the time, so to get updates from the server all the time, maybe because it's kind of resource constrained on the server because it takes a lot of resources to keep everything live, then the live data system that we have is actually a little bit difficult to work with. So people kind of ran into bottlenecks. And we realized that GraphQL kind of lets us get around the first constraint of only supporting MongoDB. So with GraphQL, you can support everything. But because it's such a high-level abstraction, you also need to do a lot more work yourself, right? You have to write these resolve functions and stuff like that. And our intention is to eventually make that as easy as it is to use Meteor's live data system now. But it's quite a long way there because we have to preserve the flexibility at every point. And so I would say the main difference between sort of the Meteor data system and GraphQL right now, if you're thinking about using it, is that the Meteor data system gives you really a lot of power out of the box. If what you want is a live data system that automatically synchronizes clients and servers, and you have a MongoDB database, or you can funnel your data into a MongoDB database if you want that synchronized. On the other hand, GraphQL is great and Apollo is great if you want to have a lot of flexibility and you want to be able to switch out your backends, connect different microservices and things like that. But you do not yet get the kind of reactivity, and it's a lot more work on the back end to hook things up. I would say on the front end, it's actually almost as simple. Not quite as simple because Meteor has this really nice abstraction of these methods that you run the same thing on the client as you run on the server. But with Apollo client, you can also do optimistic updates. You just have to write a little bit more configuration. But our intention is still to eventually close the loop. We're about maybe a third or only a quarter there. So we're building subscriptions now. We have plans to support live queries and to support streaming and defer and all the cool things in GraphQL, or that have been proposed for GraphQL but not yet implemented. But it's really quite a long way still to go. So if Meteor is good for you now and you love working with it, then I would recommend that unless you have a pain point where you feel like you need to change out the data layer and you need to use Apollo or GraphQL, at least for parts of your app, then I would say just if you're happy with Meteor, just stick with the Meteor data loading system.
Yeah, I think that was the last question. So Jonas, also from my side, thanks so much for your time. I think David is now taking over, and I get
thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. And if you guys have more questions, don't hesitate to ask on the Apollo Slack, or find us on GitHub or anywhere you want, or on Twitter.
My time, but it's more the boring part, but also important, because for making possible this, I would like just to do a mention with Portia, that is the developer relationship in Meteor that has been do also these connections. So a big applause to her that is not here, but I would like also, a shout out to her about her help. And yeah, also Apollo GraphQL, for giving the opportunity to do this connection here in Barcelona with GraphQL team. Thanks so much. And yeah, so we have, so Jonas has already quit also.